Lake Mead continues to retreat along the stark desert walls of Nevada and Arizona, exposing pale mineral bathtub rings that now tower above the waterline like warnings carved into stone. Marina docks that once floated high above deep blue water have repeatedly been lowered, relocated, or left stranded. Intake pipes that were engineered decades ago for a stable reservoir have become symbols of anxiety across the American Southwest. Yet while the nation watches the slow decline of the country's largest reservoir, another massive water project has been rising hundreds of miles away in northern Colorado. Bulldozers, concrete crews, and giant earth-moving machines have spent years constructing a new dam and reservoir known as Chimney Hollow Reservoir, a project carrying a price tag of more than $2 billion and designed to store tens of billions of gallons of water. The contrast appears almost contradictory. Why would the United States build a major new reservoir while the Colorado River system is already under historic stress? Why invest enormous sums into storing additional water when Lake Mead and Lake Powell continue to decline? Why construct another large dam project in an era defined by drought, shrinking snowpack, and intensifying political battles over water rights? Those questions sit at the center of one of the most revealing water stories unfolding in the American West. Chimney Hollow Reservoir is not simply another lake. It is part of a larger effort to reshape how water is captured, moved, stored, and protected across Colorado's Front Range, where rapid population growth continues to increase demand even as climate pressures tighten the region's water supply. Located west of the city of Loveland in Larimer County, Colorado, the project represents one of the largest new reservoir developments in the western United States in decades. The reservoir is being built as part of the Northern Integrated Supply Project, often abbreviated as NSP, a long-planned regional water storage system intended to provide additional supplies to a collection of fast-growing communities and water districts in northern Colorado. Those participating entities include municipalities and providers serving expanding suburban and agricultural areas stretching along the northern Front Range corridor. At the heart of the project stands Chimney Hollow Dam, a colossal structure designed to hold back a vast artificial reservoir within a rugged valley surrounded by foothills and rock formations. Once completed, the reservoir is expected to store approximately 90,000 acre-feet of water. In more familiar terms, that equals roughly 29 billion gallons, or around 110 billion liters of water. The scale is enormous, even by Western reservoir standards. The dam itself is designed to rise approximately 350 feet, or about 107 meters, above the valley floor, making it one of the tallest dams constructed in Colorado in generations. The crest length stretches roughly 2,100 feet, equivalent to about 640 meters. Engineers selected a rockfill embankment design using massive quantities of earth and rock materials compacted into a broad structure capable of resisting immense hydraulic pressure. Unlike famous concrete dams such as Hoover Dam, Chimney Hollow relies primarily on layers of rock and earth rather than a towering concrete wall. That design reflects both geological conditions and modern engineering preferences for certain large reservoir systems. The dam contains millions of cubic yards of material excavated, transported, and compacted using enormous fleets of trucks and heavy machinery. The project cost has steadily climbed over the years as inflation, construction expenses, and material prices increased. Estimates have moved beyond $2 billion, placing Chimney Hollow among the most expensive water infrastructure projects currently underway in the western United States. Supporters view the project as a long-term insurance policy against instability in water supply. The reservoir's main purpose is not hydroelectric generation or flood control. Instead, it is fundamentally about water storage reliability. Colorado's Front Range has experienced persistent population growth for decades. Communities north of Denver have expanded rapidly as housing developments, commercial centers, and industrial facilities continue spreading across former agricultural land. Every new subdivision, business complex, and municipal expansion increases pressure on existing water systems. Many of those communities already depend heavily on rivers fed by mountain snowpack. The challenge is that snowmelt timing has become less predictable, while drought cycles have intensified across the Colorado River Basin. Water managers increasingly fear situations in which wet years produce strong runoff, but dry years leave insufficient reserves. Reservoirs are therefore seen as mechanisms for capturing water during favorable periods and storing it for future use. That logic explains the central purpose of Chimney Hollow Reservoir. During years with higher river flows, water can be diverted and stored. During drier years, stored supplies can help participating communities avoid shortages. The water destined for Chimney Hollow primarily comes from the Colorado River Basin on the western side of the Continental Divide. Through an elaborate system of tunnels, canals, and diversions that already exists across Colorado, water can be transported eastward toward growing Front Range communities. This aspect of the project is one reason it became so controversial. The Colorado River system is already strained. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two giant reservoirs anchoring the lower basin system, have both experienced dramatic declines during the long megadrought affecting the American Southwest. Scientists examining tree ring records and historical climate data have concluded that the region is experiencing one of the driest periods in centuries. Lake Mead, created by Hoover Dam on the Nevada-Arizona border, is critically important because it supplies water to millions of people in Nevada, Arizona, California, and parts of Mexico. The reservoir also supports agriculture, municipal systems, and power generation. When water levels decline, the consequences ripple across the Southwest economy. Lake Powell, formed by Glen Canyon Dam upstream in Utah and Arizona, functions as a giant storage bank that helps regulate flows toward Lake Mead. The two reservoirs operate together as the backbone of the lower Colorado River system. The problem is that the river now carries significantly less water than 20th century planners originally assumed when major water allocation agreements were established. Decades ago, negotiators divided the river among states during unusually wet periods, effectively promising more water than the river can consistently provide under modern climate conditions. As temperatures rise across the Southwest, evaporation increases while snowpack patterns change. Less snow accumulates in some years, and melting often occurs earlier in the season. Soil moisture deficits also absorb more runoff before water can reach streams and reservoirs. The result is a system where less water ultimately flows downstream. Against that backdrop, critics argue that constructing additional diversion and storage projects upstream worsens pressure on an already stressed basin. Chimney Hollow Reservoir itself is not large enough to directly determine the fate of Lake Mead or Lake Powell. Compared with those enormous reservoirs, its capacity is relatively small. Lake Mead alone can store more than 28 million acre-feet when full, vastly larger than Chimney Hollow's 90,000 acre-feet. Yet the symbolism matters. Every upstream diversion affects the broader river system to some degree. Water stored in Colorado for Front Range use is water that may not continue downstream into the Colorado River system that feeds Lake Powell and eventually Lake Mead. Even relatively modest reductions accumulate when combined with numerous other projects, diversions, and growing demands across the basin. Critics therefore see Chimney Hollow as part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated project. Environmental groups and conservation advocates raised multiple concerns during years of legal battles and permitting reviews. Some opponents argued the project would further damage river ecosystems by removing additional water from streams that already experience seasonal stress. Others warned about impacts on fish habitat, water temperature, sediment transport, and overall ecological health. Certain stretches of the Cache-la-Poudre River became a central focus of those disputes. The river, known simply as the Poudre River by many residents, flows through northern Colorado and serves both environmental and recreational functions. Opponents feared increased diversions could reduce flows during important ecological periods. Another criticism centered on the broader philosophy behind the project. Opponents questioned whether building additional reservoirs represents a sustainable response in an era when climate change may permanently reduce water availability. They argued that conservation, efficiency improvements, wastewater recycling, and reduced consumption should receive greater emphasis, instead of expanding storage tied to continued growth. Growth itself became part of the controversy. Critics argued that large infrastructure projects often encourage additional suburban expansion, which in turn increases future water demand. In that sense, they viewed Chimney Hollow not merely as a response to growth, but as infrastructure enabling even more development across northern Colorado. The permitting process became lengthy and contentious. Federal reviews stretched over years as agencies examined environmental impacts and mitigation measures. Lawsuits challenged approvals, while negotiations produced various conditions intended to reduce ecological damage. Eventually, however, the project secured the approvals necessary to proceed. Construction accelerated during the early and middle years of the decade. Massive excavation operations transformed the landscape as crews reshaped valleys, installed infrastructure, and assembled the enormous embankment. Trucks hauled rock and earth continuously across the site. Specialized engineering teams monitored slope stability, foundation preparation, drainage systems, and compaction processes essential for long-term dam safety. The project's timeline extended across several years due to its sheer scale. Building a major reservoir is not simply a matter of pouring concrete or erecting a wall. Foundations must withstand extraordinary pressure over decades. Spillways, outlet systems, diversion structures, and monitoring equipment all require extensive engineering precision. By 2026, Chimney Hollow Reservoir had become one of the most visible water infrastructure projects underway in the western United States. Major portions of dam construction were substantially advanced, though work continued on various structural and operational systems. The surrounding region increasingly reflected the transformation from a natural valley into a future reservoir basin. Its emergence has unfolded during a period of continuing uncertainty for the Colorado River Basin. Lake Mead and Lake Powell have experienced fluctuating recoveries and declines depending on seasonal runoff conditions, emergency conservation agreements, and temporary wet winters. Some years brought improved snowpack that modestly boosted reservoir levels. Other years reinforced concerns about long-term decline. The underlying structural problem remains unresolved. The Colorado River Basin supports roughly 40 million people across 7 U.S. states and parts of Mexico. Agriculture consumes enormous quantities of water throughout the basin, particularly in regions producing winter vegetables, cattle feed, and other crops. Cities continue expanding. At the same time, climate pressures continue reducing long-term reliability. Federal authorities have repeatedly warned that existing water consumption levels are unsustainable without major reductions. Negotiations among basin states have become increasingly tense as each region seeks to protect its own supplies while avoiding catastrophic reservoir declines. In that context, projects like Chimney Hollow reveal a broader reality about Western water management. States and communities are no longer waiting for a single grand solution to save the basin. Instead, many are pursuing localized storage, conservation, recycling, and infrastructure projects simultaneously. Small projects matter because water systems across the West are interconnected through thousands of individual decisions. Chimney Hollow alone will not drain Lake Mead. Yet dozens of similar projects, combined with population growth and warming temperatures, collectively shape the future of the basin. At the same time, supporters argue that abandoning storage projects entirely would create different risks. Colorado communities still require reliable municipal water supplies. Existing reservoirs were designed around historical conditions that may no longer apply. Capturing water during favorable runoff periods can help buffer future shortages, especially when drought cycles intensify. This tension defines much of the modern Western water debate. One side argues that the era of endless growth supported by new diversions and reservoirs must end because the river system can no longer sustain 20th century assumptions. The other side argues that rapidly growing communities cannot simply halt development and therefore require updated infrastructure to survive an increasingly volatile climate. Chimney Hollow exists directly at the intersection of those competing realities. The engineering behind the project also highlights how modern reservoir construction differs from many iconic 20th century dams. Large federal projects such as Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam were often justified through combinations of hydroelectric power generation, irrigation expansion, flood control, and national economic development. They symbolized an era when massive infrastructure represented technological triumph over arid landscapes. Modern projects tend to be more targeted and regionally focused. Chimney Hollow is primarily about municipal supply reliability rather than grand national transformation. Its planners emphasize operational flexibility, storage efficiency, and regional coordination rather than monumental expansion. Still, the symbolism of building a new dam while iconic reservoirs shrink has proven impossible to ignore. Images of Lake Mead's exposed shorelines circulate constantly across media platforms. Headlines frequently warn about dead pool conditions, referring to levels so low that water could no longer flow downstream through Hoover Dam. Lake Powell has faced similar concerns about hydropower generation thresholds. Against that backdrop, construction of another reservoir naturally raises questions about priorities and long-term strategy. Some observers interpret projects like Chimney Hollow as evidence that Western states remain committed to securing every possible drop of water, regardless of basin-wide consequences. Others see them as practical adaptations necessary for survival in a harsher climate era. Both interpretations contain elements of truth. The Western United States has always depended on water engineering. Major cities such as Las Vegas, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Denver expanded largely because reservoirs, aqueducts, tunnels, and diversion systems made large-scale settlement possible in dry regions. Without that infrastructure, much of the modern Southwest economy would not exist in its current form. Yet, the climate conditions underpinning those systems are changing. The long drought affecting the basin is not merely a temporary anomaly. Rising temperatures fundamentally alter hydrology even during years with near-average precipitation. More moisture evaporates from reservoirs and soils. Snow melts earlier. Rivers behave differently. That means future water planning increasingly revolves around uncertainty rather than stability. Reservoirs themselves also face limitations. Building more storage does not create new water. Reservoirs only capture and redistribute available supply. If long-term river flows continue declining, even large storage systems eventually face pressure. This is why critics argue the true basin crisis extends far beyond any individual reservoir project. Lake Mead's decline reflects structural overallocation, climate warming, population growth, and agricultural demand spread across an enormous geographic region. No single dam, pipeline, or conservation program can independently solve the imbalance between supply and demand. The same reality applies to Chimney Hollow. Its reservoir may help participating Colorado communities stabilize future municipal supplies. It may provide greater operational flexibility during dry years. It may reduce vulnerability to seasonal fluctuations, but it does not resolve the larger Colorado River crisis affecting the Southwest. In fact, the reservoir's existence underscores how fragmented Western water management often remains. Each state, region, and municipality pursues projects designed to secure its own future, even while the overall basin system faces collective strain. That fragmentation has defined Colorado River politics for generations. Upper basin states such as Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico frequently argue they are entitled to continue developing water allocated under historic agreements. Lower basin states such as Arizona, Nevada, and California depend heavily on downstream reservoir storage and long-established delivery systems. Tribal nations also possess significant water rights that remain central to future negotiations. Every major project therefore exists within a larger political and hydrological struggle. As 2026 progresses, Chimney Hollow Reservoir stands as both infrastructure and symbol. It represents adaptation, ambition, growth pressure, engineering capability, and continuing conflict over the future of Western water. Its towering dam rising above the Colorado landscape demonstrates that despite mounting climate concerns, the American West is still building major water projects. Reservoir construction did not end with the 20th century. Instead, it evolved into a more regional, politically contested, and environmentally scrutinized process. Meanwhile, Lake Mead continues confronting the relentless arithmetic of the modern Colorado River Basin. Less water enters the system than many users historically consumed. Conservation agreements temporarily slow declines, but long-term imbalance remains. Reservoir levels rise after strong snow years and fall again during dry periods. Emergency negotiations repeatedly attempt to avoid deeper crisis. The enormous white mineral bands around Lake Mead remain visible reminders that the basin's old assumptions no longer hold. Chimney Hollow Reservoir does not erase those realities. It reflects them. Communities facing uncertainty are trying to secure reserves before conditions worsen further. Water managers increasingly treat storage reliability as essential protection against volatility. Local projects move forward because waiting for basin-wide consensus often appears politically impossible. That may ultimately be one of the clearest explanations for why America is still building dams while major reservoirs shrink. The crisis itself is driving construction. Fear of future shortages encourages states and municipalities to strengthen their own systems wherever possible. Every region seeks resilience. Every provider wants flexibility. Every growing community fears becoming vulnerable to restrictions or declining supplies. Yet resilience for one region can mean additional pressure for another. That tension ensures the debate surrounding Chimney Hollow will continue long after construction crews finish shaping the reservoir basin. The project embodies a defining challenge of the 21st century American West, managing growth, climate stress, and water scarcity simultaneously within a river system already stretched beyond historical limits. Lake Mead's decline reveals the scale of the problem. Chimney Hollow Reservoir reveals how states are responding. Neither can be understood in isolation from the other.